Hello everybody! In today's world, more and more websites are designed in the mobile-first approach, and those who are not still need to be tested for mobile use. This is Stef from Samayas, and welcome to my channel. In the old days, web development was mainly done through HTML and CSS only. Then came the CSS frameworks, like Bootstrap or Foundation Zerp or Material UI. And others, of course. The approach of Foundation Zerp was mobile first from the start. While in Bootstrap, in the beginning it wasn't, but then it evolved. But now that we have our perfect website, which is mobile first, how do we test it? Well, of course, on most modern browsers, when resizing, your site will adapt. Then when we go to debug tools in your browser, you have in general the option to switch either to mobile and/or tablet. And you can even define the dimensions we want. We can also tweak around with the performance, the speed, etc. But it's never the real deal, is it? Of course, we could run it on a real mobile or tablet device. But in general, that requires some kind of deployment. If we're working with a complete mock-up website, that might be feasible. But in bigger projects with multiple developers, both front and back, that might just be a little bit more complicated. Between the start of a project and the time some infrastructure is in place in more corporate organizations, that takes a while. Plus, in general, there are some deployment pipelines to be put in place. So as a single front-end developer, starting to test something for the mobile-first approach on a real device isn't that easy. So in comes the simulators. Technically, you have an Android and iOS simulators. Now we can run the Android simulator on a Windows machine. However, running an iOS simulator on a Windows machine isn't really an option. We can, however, run the iOS simulator on a Mac using Xcode. Of course, this assumption only works if you have enough rights to download and/or install some software, which in some corporate environments might not always be easy. Well, me in my background, I'm mainly a Windows guy. But it would be very wrong of me to assume that all web development happens only on Windows, of course. I do still have an older Intel Mac laying around to play around and test out. An alternative might also be tunnels, which are offered by either third-party tools or Visual Studio itself. But in a corporate environment with proxies and authentication, that might also be an issue. I'll cover that in another video. So now let's dig in. What will I cover today? First, I made a small mobile-first website. Next, I'll install Android Studio and create some simulators. We could also do the simulators through Visual Studio, of course. And then finally, I'll have a look on my Mac with Xcode and iOS simulator. So I created a little testing application. I created an ASP.NET MVC core sample based on the previous samples I've already done. I have a standard home controller, nothing much, it just displays a view. I have my program.cs, which is just a standard plumbing. I have my index view, which is just dummy lorem ipsum and some bootstrap. And I have a CSS, which customizes depending if you're on large, medium or small. A tweak I've also done in launch settings to be able to test later on my Mac settings. Instead of having localhost here, I replaced it and I added 0.0.0.0. So now my website locally on this machine can be accessed from my Mac. And so I don't need to do a setup on the Mac. And so I can just use my Mac emulator to test out this website on this machine. However, if you're in a corporate environment, you might not be able to change out of the box your firewall settings, and that might not be an option. Also, in Bootstrap, I created some tweaks. I created 3 blocks, 3 columns, 4 for large, 6 for medium, and 12 for small. However, since in my CSS, I also wanted to have a nice little border with color that changes depending on where you are, I had to do a little tweak. And I had to create a second div for my custom border, because otherwise the 4 columns for large takes up the whole space. And if I add a border, my margin here of 2, that means I go over it, and instead of having 3 columns, I only have 2. By tweaking it this way, that fixed the issue. Now let's have a little run. So as you can see, my state-of-the-art designed website, but you get the point. In large, I have 3 columns, and my borders are blue. If I switch to medium, I have 2 columns and my borders become orange. If I go to small, I have 1 column and my border becomes red. Now let's have a look in the debug tools. And here, if we switch to the tablet or iPhone mode, it switched to an iPhone. Everything is red. Now let's switch to an iPad. I need to make it a little bit larger, but as you can see, I have the iPad dimensions and I'm in my orange mode. The alignment is not there yet, but that's not the goal of the exercise, of course. Or in the end, this is the goal of the exercise, where based on what you see, you can fine-tune your layout to have the perfect layout for what you're looking for. Let's switch to an Android. Again, we're small. And of course here, we can tweak our dimensions, should we choose to. We could also choose throttling, but that's not the goal of the exercise. And so this is the playing field which we'll be working on. So now in order to set up Android Studio, we first need to go to developer.android.com/studio. And here we need to click on the Android Studio download link. I've already downloaded it, so I won't re-download it again. So next, if you go to your download folder, you will have your Android Studio. Depending on when you do that, you will have the latest version. And if you double click on it, you will have a small little wizard. It'll prompt you for admin rights. And so if you're not administrator of your machine, that might be an issue. But I tried declining the admin rights and I get this error message. So let's try again and give it the admin rights. So you have a nice little wizard where you can do next, next, next. It first asks you whether you want to install Android virtual devices next to the Android Studio. Of course we select that. It asks you where you want to store it. We'll leave the default folder. It also asks you in what startup menu folder you want to install. We'll leave default. And then it takes some time to install and extract everything. Since everything is already downloaded, it's pretty fast in this phase. Once it's installed, then afterwards we can start downloading extra images, and that might take some time. And final next, and it's installed, and it asks us whether or not to start it up or not. So we'll finish. First it asks us whether or not we want to share some statistics with Google or not. I choose not to, but it's up to you to do what you want. And so after my Android Studio starts up, we get this window. If we go into settings and then SDK manager, we can decide whether or not we want to download extra Android versions or not. The latest or not, the previous, or all the way back to Android 2. Same thing from extra SDK tools, should we need that, and update, should we need that. For now, we'll leave everything as is. And then here we have the device manager and we can explore our devices. So we'll add a new device, create a new device, a nice little wizard. So the first thing I want, let's take a Pixel 9 Pro XL. Let's say next. I'll leave it for that. I'll take the API 35 Android 15 and not Android 16, since I think Android 16 is not released yet. We can choose whether or not we need the Google Play Store or not. I'll leave it for now. And we select the image we want for this device. We also have additional settings where we could tweak certain things. We could specify whether or not we have a camera front or rear and how it should behave. We can play around whether or not our mobile phone is on full speed or on GSM to see the latency of the website and or images. We can choose to start in portrait or landscape. We can have a quick or cold boot, and we can specify the size of disk it have. For now, we'll leave everything as is. I'll just click on finish. And so I have my first mobile phone simulator. I'll immediately create a tablet as well, so I'll create a second device. Now I'll go to tablet. I will take a Pixel tablet, take next again put it on 35, change nothing else, and just say finish. And so now we have our two devices ready. So let's start up the mobile phone. And so I get a new window, running devices, and it's starting the emulator. On first start that takes a while. And as you can see here, for those who want to do real Android development, we have a full access to all the files on the device. But we only need the device for surfing. And 5 minutes later, we have our mobile phone running. Now let's start up our tablet as well. And so in the same running device window, we have our tablet starting up. Here we start in landscape. Let's switch and rotate. It's again as slow as the first. And we have our tablet up and running. Now out of the box, of course we have Chrome. We could install other browsers should we choose to, but I won't for now. I start up Chrome. At first it has some annoying initial setup. You want to identify, etc. Use without an account. No thanks. And now we have a working browser connected to the internet, if it can get through your firewall, etc. So now on one side we have our Visual Studio project running, and it's running in localhost. Localhost in general is an IP address of 127.0.0.1. And technically, on the other side, we have our Android emulator, and both environments are completely separated. So now the first trick I already exposed. Technically, this one could serve to the public IP address. However, Android has a nice little tweak, and by entering, and in essence, 10.0.2.2 is a substitute for localhost. And so Android Studio integrated that so that when we enter HTTPS 10.0.2.2 and the port number, it's as if we access the localhost or website. Of course, there's always the certificate issue, which you need to bypass at first. But then, as you can see, we have our mobile website in tablet mode. Now let's try the same on the Android phone. Again, open the browser, use without an account, probably the same questions, no thanks, got it, cancel. Again, the certificate question, and we have our website running on a mobile phone. And now if you want to tweak something, let's just tweak some text. Let's do a quick hop to reload. Let's switch to the Android Studio. Let's do a refresh, and it's updated. And so this way, we have a very easy way to debug our mobile application completely local. Let's refresh one final time on a tablet, and again, everything is modified. And so if we go back to our Add New Devices, we can be very creative. We can test from very old browsers to very new browsers. We can go to a desktop, we can go to TV, we can play around on automotive. We can use very different kinds of resolutions. I want to test on a small Pixel 5, which has a different resolution, etc., etc. And with very few effort, we can test loads of different mobiles at no cost whatsoever. So when you open Xcode and you go to Open Developer Tools, we have Simulator. And so when I open an iPad, let's try the 11-inch iPad Pro. I get my iPad. Let's now open up a browser, Safari. Since my iMac is quite old, it isn't that fast. So let's enter the URL we want to go through. Of course, there's an SSL issue. I continue visit website. I do a refresh. And as we can see, we have our iPad working and we can start debugging. Now let's try the iPhone. Kill this. So when we open up then Safari on the iPhone, emulator, here we can clearly see it's a mobile approach. And so now we have a second emulator. And that's it. So as we can see, by being a little bit creative, there are still some ways to tweak and test web projects from the start on different mobile configurations. If you're a full Mac dev, then next to Xcode emulator, Android Studio is also fully supported. You can find the source code on GitHub in the link down below. If you guys enjoy this content, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell sign. Or leave a comment down below.